The story starts in 2010, where we see a shift in the film industry. Digital cinema cameras have been around for a while. Powerhouses like Panasonic and Sony had each shown off their own models, and new players like Red helped to create a competitive market. However, when filmmakers picked their camera of choice, they usually ended up going with the standard 35mm. No digital system had convinced the industry as a whole to make the switch. That is, until Arri released the original Alexa. For the last 15 years, we've had 3 generations of this camera, and on the spec sheet, there's never really been anything too exceptional about it. It never really had the highest resolution or the fastest frame rates, its low light capabilities had never really been exceptional, and the expensive price you need to pay to get your hands on one of these certainly doesn't help. But Arri knew their market, and they realized that making a good camera isn't about specs. Directors didn't want to give up on film because they liked the way the film looked. They liked how it controlled highlights and how its colors changed the natural world in a way that feels cinematic. So Arri spent their time and money refining their color science and expanding their camera's dynamic range, all based on the imaging characteristics of Kodak's color negative. 15 years later, we now have an industry where 90% of productions are shot on digital, and the most sought after cameras are the Arris.
Arri proved that good color science and encoding is more important than crazy high-spec numbers when it comes to creating a beautiful image. How cheap and unrefined hardware can you get away with if your processing is still good? The cool thing is that all of Arri's color science and encoding schemes are published on their white papers, which means that as long as you have access to the raw data collected from the camera and to do your math right, you can apply Arri color science to it. Unfortunately, most affordable consumer cameras lock that raw data away. Before you can get to the footage, the camera is already compressed, quantized, and encoded into a light and efficient package. It's great for sharing online, but not for applying major color processing steps. This is where Magic Lantern comes in. In 2009, a developer named Trammell Hudson released an open source firmware for the Canon 5D Mark II, allowing the camera to pull raw frames off the sensor at 24 frames a second. Suddenly, a huge community grew around this firmware, adding loads of new features and support for more cameras in the lineup, including this compact USM. The best part is that once you have your footage all recorded, you can export it from their Magic Lantern app in essentially any color space and encoding scheme, including Alexa Log C, Arri Wide Gamut, essentially making your Canon USM a pocket Alexa. So here's the question. If specs don't matter, can an old cheap point and shoot effectively impersonate a $50,000 cinema camera? And if so, how far can you push it before the illusion begins to break down?
We'll begin by measuring sharpness and the modulation transfer function, or MTF. Resolution has been a historic sore spot surrounding the Alexa name since until pretty recently, when they crossed the 4K barrier on their Super 35 cameras. This famously withheld the Alexa from the Netflix approved list, but most DPs didn't care. Resolution as a metric is just a number and typically tells you very little about how well a camera actually picks up and preserves fine details within an image. The Alexa may not have the most pixels, only recording 3.2K, but we can expect it to make the most of the pixels it has. We expect the opposite of the Canon EOS M. This sensor is much higher resolution than the Alexa. At 5.99K, we have almost 2.5 times more pixels than the other guy. However, we aren't able to use nearly that many of them. Since the Canon uses a standard SD card slot that tops out at 80 megabits per second, we can only reliably record 2 megapixels of the 18 on the sensor, nearly 4 times less than the Alexa's 7.5 megapixels. This means that we have to get clever with how we read those pixels off the sensor. We could just grab them from the center, but this essentially crops into our sensor, requiring us to use wider lenses and give up artistic tools like a shallow depth of field. The other option is to use the full area of the sensor and to skip 2 rows and 2 columns for each sample. This is known as 3x3 mode, and it works great, but the large gaps between pixels mean that we are more vulnerable to aliasing and moire artifacts due to undersampling errors. The last option we have is 3x1 mode. In this mode, we still skip 2 columns, but sample every row. This is known as an anamorphic mode. Like shooting on an anamorphic glass, the image looks squeezed out of the camera and we must de-squeeze it post due to the greater sampling vertically than horizontally. In theory, this mode is the best of both worlds, since it lets us use the full sensor width while also resolving many of the aliasing and moire issues of the 3x3 mode. Unfortunately, this is also where the hacked mirrorless camera starts to show its open sourceness. Multiple times on set, the camera dropped frames while recording in 14 bits in 1x3, Dropping down to 12 bits fixed the issue, but we see a massive increase in rolling shutter duration in 1:3 mode, which can become extremely noticeable in scenes with high motion. Since our tests were primarily focused on tone transfer and color reproduction, we decided to shoot 14-bit 3:3 mode as our base setting. But how big a compromise are we making? First, we photographed an MTF chart with the Alexa in 3.2K and the Canon in each of the 3 shooting modes. As you might expect, no matter the shooting mode, the Alexa was able to massively outperform the Canon at capturing high frequencies. But what does that mean in the real world? When punching into the Alexa footage, we see the limitations of its lower resolution sensor. However, we don't see any aliasing or moire artifacts. This is not the sort of camera you can expect to have great flexibility when reframing images in post, but giving you use the full frame, the sensor provides more than enough fidelity for pleasing 2K and 4K viewing. How about the Canon? In 1:1 mode, we can see exactly how noticeable the crop is compared to the Alexa, but it appears to resolve good detail throughout the image with no noticeable aliasing or moire effects. The 3x crop mode means it isn't practical for most shooting, but in a pinch, it can make a good alternative to switching to a longer focal length lens. 3x3 gives us our full frame back, but we certainly pay for it. The organic parts of the scene look fine, maybe a little soft, but not particularly offensive. However, we can see noticeable moire artifacts in uniform high-frequency areas, like the bricks on the building to the right. Additionally, we can also see extreme aliasing on the edge of the building. Punching in, we can see in general the high frequency has been lost, especially when compared to the Alexa, and noticeable color fringing in high contrast points, although this may be more due to chromatic aberration from the lower end photo lens we used. Moving on to the 1:3 mode, we can see a greatly improved image. It's clear that much of the detail in the horizontal high-frequency areas has been lost, but vertically, the detail from the bricks has returned quite nicely. Additionally, we aren't seeing any of the extreme moire or aliasing artifacts we had in 3:3 mode. Overall, it's still noticeably softer than the Alexa Mini, and we'd say that 1:3 is just barely sharp enough for 4K viewing, while 3:3 mode is just barely sharp enough for 2K and HD viewing.
Next, let's talk about noise and dynamic range. These qualities show us how far the lighting in each scene can be pushed before they start to break down. The first thing we should mention is that the Alexa's native ISO is 800, while the Canon's is 100. This means that at these ISOs, the cameras will have the most dynamic range. It also means that in low light scenarios, the Arri will perform much better with far less noise in the shadows. For the tests in controlled lighting environments, we placed 3 stops of ND on the Alexa so that both cameras could shoot at their native ISOs and maximize their performance while still keeping the scene's luminance constant. At a normal exposure, the Alexa has a bit less noticeable noise, which is likely due to the larger scale of the pixels on the sensor. However, the difference as a whole is minor. When underexposing a scene by 2 stops, then correcting it in post, the amplified noise makes the gap between the cameras much larger. The Canon suffers and appears to have some fixed noise patterns that have been uncorrected. Meanwhile, the Alexa, while still noisier than before, can still be considered usable with a bit of denoising in post. While the noise performance isn't exceptional, we should point out that the tone and color both hold up well, which is impressive considering we are comparing compressed ProRes 4444 outputs for both. When overexposing the scene by 2 stops, we see that both cameras do an excellent job of recovering detail. To truly test these 2 cameras' highlight control, we're going to need to push the scene further. Arri claims that the Alexa Mini is capable of capturing 7 stops over and 7 stops under for a total dynamic range of 14 stops. Canon has not officially posted the dynamic range of the EOS M, but chart testing shows us that it is capable of between 11.5 to 12 stops from clip to crush. When testing, the Alexa spec sheets appear to be accurate with a calculated 14 stops off the chart. But like resolution, these numbers only tell us so much. How do they handle a more practical scenario? We constructed a high dynamic range scene that begins in darkness, but progressively light fills the room, beginning with a glow stick, followed by a computer monitor, desk lamp, overhead lights, and then spotlights. We can see neither of the cameras were able to pull out the illumination from the glow stick or the computer monitor very well, with the desk lamp being our first real example of shadows. While there is more noticeable noise in the Canon frame, there does not appear to be any detail getting crushed with the Alexa. With the second spotlight, we begin to see the Canon run out of dynamic range. Highlights become noticeably clipped with details and definition being lost. That being said, it is still impressive how the highlights roll off the Canon, making the transition to clip not too jarring. The Alexa, meanwhile, holds up great. Parts of the frame are starting to clip, but important color detail is preserved. It's only on our final spotlight that the Alexa is overwhelmed, and the large parts of the scene, like the paper and light, are completely lost. Even more so than the Canon, the Alexa fails gracefully, having a nice roll-off as the image goes to clip.
Unsurprisingly, the more expensive, more refined, and more modern sensor of the Alexa is able to outperform the Canon with resolution and dynamic range. But that's not what this test is about. It's about color. Arri's claim to fame is their color science. It's their main thing and the reason why they can charge so much for their cameras. So, how close can the Canon get? Both of these cameras are encoded in Arri wide gamut, and both are decoded using the same 3D lookup table that is responsible for the perturbations of reality that create the Arri look. However, these cameras still sport different sensors with different spectral sensitivities and different color correction matrices to move them into Arri wide gamut. Comparing Macbeth charts, while the differences aren't massive, the Alexa is slightly more saturated, especially in the greens and blues. To put these color differences to the test, we did a series of product shots using recognizable brand colors. In some shots, the differences are subtle, like the Wonder Bread, Cheetos bag, and Windex. Overall, the red appears to be much richer on the Alexa, particularly noticeable on the Doritos bag and Campbell's soup, and green and blues just have a bit more pop to them on the Alexa, and overall appear a bit more filmic. Meanwhile, the Canon favors more of a neutral look, which is not necessarily a bad thing and can leave more room for creative adjustments. Additionally, we set up a skin tone test and found the cameras perform extremely well without any noticeable differences between the two. All of these tests are in controlled environments with studio lights properly metered. If we want to really push the colors on these cameras, we're going to need to add a little more chaos, meaning we're going to have to go outside. The goal of the natural light test is to emulate a more run and gun approach to filmmaking. Put ourselves in the shoes of documentary crew, where we don't have a lot of time to meter or white balance. After shooting around Rochester for a couple hours, we picked out our favorite shots and handed it off to KC, our resident colorist. His goal was to provide basic artistic corrections to Alexa footage and then see how closely he could match the Canon. Take it away, KC.
Hi, I'm Casey. I'm a third-year film student, and I got to color both Alexa and Canon footage and compare them. What I kind of wanted to test with both cameras were just kind of different styles of like different kinds of grades. One of those being the quote-unquote like cinematic look. The main like aspect of it is having like some blues in the shadows and usually some like oranges in the highlights. So with the Alexa footage, I could very easily just push a little bit of blue into the shadows and that blue would just stay there. It would very clearly just be in the darker parts of the image when I touch the game. When trying to use the Canon footage, I found that that wasn't the case as much. It was very sensitive, I guess would be a good word for this. So like if I even adjusted the lift slider for the blue by even 1 point, then I would start seeing a lot of changes all across the images. Using the Alexa was just a lot easier in the sense that I felt like I had a lot more freedom with how I colored it. Like I could get them pretty close, but still not as close as I think that I would like, to be honest. There were some colors that were just very different overall, like blues. Like there's this one shot, there's this lady, she's wearing like a blue, like, I don't know, like a tracksuit, like jacket kind of thing. And in the Alexa footage, it's this very light blue. But in the Canon footage, it's a very dark blue. And that's like super easy to fix with like secondaries, just like picking the color and changing the hue or the saturation or whatever. But with just the primaries, it was impossible to fix that jacket without affecting literally everything else. So like those like two specific colors I couldn't match, but the overall image looked pretty similar, like contrast-wise, color-wise, pretty similar. I never got like perfect one-to-one with everything, but a lot of them were like close enough where like at first glance, they're like, okay, these were shot at the same time with the same settings and were colored the same way, roughly.
So, can a Canon USM effectively impersonate an Alexa?
Yes!
No.
Well, maybe it's best for you to decide. For all of our interview segments, the Canon USM has served as our A cam, meanwhile the Arri Alexa has served as our B cam. While the Canon is clearly outclassed with superior color management and dynamic range from the Alexa, it nonetheless puts up a great fight, and dare we say, goes the distance. For most scenes, we intentionally create scenarios that would push these cameras to their limits. Most controlled and uncontrolled lighting environments are not going to push the Canon that far. But you can't argue that no matter the scenario, the Alexa was noticeably sharper in every test. This is mostly down to user error. We elected to shoot in 3x3 mode since that gave us the best stability at 14 bits. We could have easily shot the EOS M in 1x3 anamorphic mode at 12 bits, which we saw didn't perform all that much worse than the Arri and practical scenes. And in retrospect, it probably wouldn't have made too big a difference in color or dynamic range. But even then, when the Canon starts to break down, it breaks down quickly. We saw that the Alexa could see better in the dark and control the highlights far better. Even if the scene works within the Canon's limits, you have to be far more careful with it. The Alexa gives you way more room to misexpose or mess up your settings and still recover a great shot. Operation of the Alexa was a million times easier than on the Canon. You don't need to worry about 1x1 or 1x3 shooting modes or getting the wrong bit depth crashing your camera. The Alexa just gives you everything you need and nothing you don't, and it just works. At the same time, the Canon can fit in your jeans pocket. You can carry it and all of your accessories with you in a backpack. Its size means you can put it in tight places and mount it on handheld stabilizers. Plus, the breakdown took 1/10 the time as on the Alexa. But the Alexa size can be an advantage too. It's easier to mount accessories like a follow focus, matte box, and external monitor because it's a box camera. At the end of the day, we're not really trying to see what is the better filmmaking tool. The Alexa is always going to be superior. The theory is that smart color science compensates for cheap hardware. And while the Canon falls short in many areas, if you don't think of these cameras as an imaging device and instead think of them as a storytelling tool, given you know the limits of the Canon, it's every bit as capable of creating beautiful frames as a $50,000 cinema camera. Arguably though, that's true for any camera. At its price point, the Canon gives you unprecedented flexibility and puts you far closer to the Arri look than just about anything. But the Arri look is not what makes a film beautiful. It may help, but it takes deliberation, artistry, and purpose. That can be done on anything, from a smartphone to a camcorder, to a cinema camera, to a decade-old point and shoot, with some fight still left in it.